Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Theoryish podcast. I am Hannah Ez. I'm not joined by Paula today because Paula is currently moving to Cardiff. I'm sure she will talk about that at some point when it's happened. But yeah, instead of Paula here today, I'm joined by Dipbuk and Roshan. Dipbuk joined us during the first season for our episode on Stuart Hall and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Roshan joined us last season for our episode with J. Daniel Luther. Dipbuk, you're at a conference today, aren't you?
Hi, Hannah. Thank you. Yes, I'm at a conference. It's at Gender Conference in the Netherlands, and it's for the next 3 days. I'm super excited because it's a feminist, queer, activist space. But I also miss Paula.
Yeah, it's amazing to have you here, though, even though we can't have Paula here. But yeah, we're also joined by Roshan.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much for having me back here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm very excited to hear what you and Dipbuk have to say. I feel that this particular article by Kang has had a significant impact in my academic journey, and I'm looking forward to see how it might have given you a new perspective on things.
So I just want to give the listeners a brief content warning. So the article that we're discussing today explicitly covers violent acts. I don't know how much we're going to be going into it today, but I just wanted to give this brief content warning in case that's not something you're up for today. You can always join us in the next episode. So the author of our article today is Akhil Kang, who is currently a PhD researcher in sociocultural anthropology at Cornell University. On Kang's research page, which I'll link in the description, they say that they're very interested in moving the anthropological gaze from the marginalized towards the elite, which is very interesting. Their current research project focuses on upper caste victimhood and woundedness in parts of North India. They focus on affect and body politics to understand what makes upper caste people upper caste. They work between the fields of critical caste and Dalit studies, feminist and queer studies, affect and media studies, and biopolitics and post-coloniality. Really interestingly, before they pursued their PhD, they previously worked as a human rights lawyer, and they've done many, many other things, which if you're interested, you can always go look at their page. So the text that we're reading today is a journal article in the Feminist Review titled Savarna, Citations of Desire, Queer Impossibilities of Inter-caste Love. The article was published in 2023 and seeks to ask queer questions of caste, unpacking what intercaste dynamics mean for social movements that rally around notions of love and desire or choose to reject them. Kang seeks to recenter desire and intimacy into caste to imagine the queer impossibilities of Dalit love. The article uses interviews and conversations with 5 Dalit queer scholars, intellectuals, and activists. So, Roshan, I was wondering, we have previously spoken about this in the J. Daniel Luther episode, but I wondered if you could give us a brief overview of caste and more particularly Dalit.
Yeah, so the first time that I encountered this essay was actually when I was trying to think through an intercaste dynamic on love and desire. And caste being something which is not overtly marked, but which is interpreted of a few. So just to give a sort of description of what caste is, I guess there's both an easy way to define caste and a difficult definition that one has to navigate. To say broadly, caste is a system of stratification within Hindu society, which imagines particular groups at the top and certain groups at the bottom. The ones at the top enjoy privileges of society, of education, of monetary possibilities. And the lower you go down the stratification, the less and less opportunities you're entitled to, quote unquote, by birth. Specifically, the Dalit community was sort of pushed outside this caste system. So the caste system envisions people within its system who are called Savarna, and those outside of it recognized as Avarnas. And the Dalit community exclusively falls within the Avarna system, which means that they do not get access to any of the rights and privileges that come with being part or being placed in any position within the caste system. And that being said, the Dalit community then is also subject to extreme degrees of violence, of impoverishment, all sorts of misgivings. And although there have been, let's say, government reforms in the country, we've had an extensive debate about how far economic reforms can actually create social reparation. And I guess what Kang's paper then pushes us to think or pushes us to confront is particularly this messiness that is left behind, the burden of caste that is left behind.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you think of opportunities, or when people talk about opportunities, often they're talking about like economic and all this kind of thing. But I think what this article does really interestingly is cover opportunities of love, of desire, like the opportunities that you have to connect to other people, which people might not think of, I guess. I wanted to hear your general thoughts before we go into a more specific discussion. And if we start with dipbuk, Roshan, if you have any more thoughts, I know you've just given some, and then I can add anything at the end.
So my initial thoughts when I read it, I read initially in a linear way, and then I go back and forth. And my initial reading was, I have a little reflection, so I'll read it out, and I think it probably sums up what I'm trying to say. So I'm referring to the quote in the article, and the quote reads, "You know, many of us don't think we deserve happiness. Caste broke our hearts, and love cannot put them back together." And the final line of Jyoti's 2022 quote is, "Our relationship with feeling less than human spans centuries. What is our love in front of this?" And my reflection on that was as follows. This quote fills me with anguish, pain, hurt, and intra-generational longevity that has yet to be reckoned with. And on the intergenerational extent, I feel unable to mute the induced silent scream, as the pain and weight is much too heavy to bear. This idea of not deserving happiness because it is such an improximate idea. All I can imagine in this is this moment, and with it feel nothingness, smell neutrality, see the endlessness, but feel it draining my senses as the depths are slowly realized as being too great. I hear the soft sound of the wind as nature slowly and gently guides me. I'm thinking of ancient and sacred lands and my connectedness long ago, but my memories can only feel the emptiness and deafening silence of absence. I can only feel my scars. I can no longer see them. This will never heal. And reading this quote and then going back to Kang's article in different readings, I think this captures how I feel.
I think for me, the sort of reaction and the kind of feeling that Kang's essay ignited was a sense of hope, to say that yes, I am dealing with a lot of negative affect. There is a lot of trauma, oppression that one cannot mitigate, one cannot do away with. But at the same time, it's a productive engagement with that negative affect. And to not sort of, I do not feel isolated with it. I feel there is a way forward to not sort of sediment my entire impression, my entire understanding and apprehension of this experience to only negativity, to then think about how love can be generative. Yes, it might not be able to, match up with what the book earlier quoted from the text itself, but at least it's something, it's still alive, it's still a spark that's there.
Thank you both. Yeah, that was really heartfelt and interesting and beautiful. The text itself is really interesting in the way that it's written. I think your responses to it are in part informed by how it's written, right? It's very heartfelt. It's very, like, you can feel the care of the author, and they really care about this topic on a very personal level. We'll talk about it a bit later, but they are also interviewing friends and people that they have like a deep relationship with. And I think that also informs this approach that is informed by care, right? And, they're an anthropologist, they used to be a lawyer, they're informed by sociology and media studies and all these things, but their writing feels a little bit out of step. And I don't mean that as a bad thing, right? It's really, it's a beautiful way of writing. And, they, at times it feels a bit literary, and they explain, their feelings in relation to other people, but they also explain like what is happening in the moment. Like there's one part where they explain like the type of day it was, right? They say sitting in front of my laptop screen, furiously typing notes, even hundreds of miles away, I could viscerally feel their exhaustion. These are parts that inform this type of writing. And yeah, I think it's really interesting. And if the audience gets a chance to read it, I really do recommend. So I think our first point, I might just let Roshan kind of introduce it if you're happy to.
I mean, just before I sort of go into that, just to sort of come back to the style of writing for a second. And yeah, we were talking about this earlier as well before recording. That's really a way of sort of speaking back pedagogically, that I need to communicate this as a lived experience, as a real life story, rather than a step back, an objective theoretical take as to how to think about being Dalit and identities and queerness and positionalities. It's the lives that people are leading. And that sort of brings me into talking about the first thing that obviously strikes me as a point of discussion is intercaste marriage as an object of study itself. And what particularly this essay brings to light is the kind of negotiations that intercaste marriage compels its participants into, both intrinsically and extrinsically. Because even within an intercaste marriage, there definitely still is a hierarchy. Someone is of an upper caste, someone is of a lower caste. And in India, at least, marriages are never in isolation. They are always a marriage between families, a marriage between traditions and cultures. So you necessarily, especially that there's a patriarchal angle to this as well, when the woman marries, she has to inherit the culture and the tradition of the man whom she is marrying. And therefore, these elements of shame, stigma, as Michael Warner would put it, all of these come to inform the dynamics of your relationship. And then to think about where love gets the space to express itself in this relationship. And as Kang also talks about, that intercaste marriage is often also radicalized by political movements. So to say I've read texts, I have read ethnographic works where people marry outside their caste as a radical political way of living. And therefore to make this decision, to take this step, is also to subject something like an intercaste union to the burden of being a political movement, to the burden of staying upright, of being able to face biases and stigma and oppression. And therefore what this subjects, I guess, the couple to is an extraordinary standard where they have to be infallible partners, they have to be an infallible couple. There's no scope for, let's say, adultery, or there's no scope for disagreement or vitriol, because then every non-ideal instance within this couplehood sort of gets sedimented, and the stereotypes attached to this relationship are concentrated on those fallacies. And yeah, of course, like, I have so much more to say, but I want to hear what you guys thought about this.
I liked that the writing for me is one that's from the heart, and I wonder if when they were doing human rights advocacy work as lawyers, I wonder if their vestiture in that vocation was one of being in close proximity to people that are disadvantaged, oppressed, marginalized by a system that is not made by them, but that is exercised upon them. And that reactionary, visceral and emotional, responsive way of writing. As you were speaking, Roshan, I was thinking of autoethnography and how it questions and queries, but this is a different kind of reflexivity that is equally as powerful because of the nuances that it contains, and I really like the style of writing for that.
Yeah, with the, I guess, inter-caste marriage relationship, I don't know if I read it in your notes, dipbuk, or if it was just from the text, but there's a question of, I guess, who gets the chance to, you know, when you were talking, Roshan, about, you know, some people do this as a radical political movement. Who gets the chance to engage in that radical political movement? And there's a really interesting through line throughout this article where Kang talks about it in relation to heteronormativity, this notion of the ideal nation, the idea of marrying upwards as an ideal to move towards. I think there's something really interesting here. I wonder what you both thought.
Yeah, in terms of, I think, to think about then how heteronormativity structures intercaste marriages, it actually goes back to the feminist movement and rallying for women, because it goes back to the woman question. And this, of course, comes in conversation when we're trying to think as a post-colonial nation while still being under colonial oppression. So where does the woman lie in between the brown man and his forms of cultural oppression or cultural structuring, and then the white man's burden, to say. And then this sort of develops, or to say it is articulated in the body, in the personhood of the woman herself. She has to be a symbol of Eastern sagehood, of Eastern mysticism and spirituality, and yet she has to be the sort of binding glue for the domestic setup to survive. So she has to take on the burden of both, of holding on the family and holding on the country itself. And then when this sort of plays out in an ideal marriage situation, then as Kang points out in one of their citations when they talk about Gayatri Gopinath and Impossible Desires, that the idea of a desiring woman, of an autonomous desiring woman, is really out of the question. It's beyond the imagination. And therefore, aspects of what an ideal nation must be is continually sort of restructuring and directing how and whom you get to love.
Even though we're not, the article says many times over that this is not not a work that seeks to look at queer relationships through the heteronormative lens. But I kind of have a little bit of reservation in the strategy in doing so. I can sometimes, looking at the heteronormative lens can take away the energy and the critique that is placed on this, looking at this way of queer relations through a queer perspective, which is very different. But in doing so, I can see the ruptures that are endemic within the heteronormative way of forming these relations. And now, when you mentioned, Roshan, the marriage structures, and it's mentioned in this article, my brain goes to a previous conference with the Centre for Studies of Women and Gender, and that was talking about heteronormative marriages, and every presenter in that was very critical of the patriarchal structures that are inherent within the Hindu structures of forming these marriages. And as we're talking about this article, I can't see a way how patriarchy can be removed from the heteronormativity of the marriage structure without having to form a different conception of how a relationship functions. So in Kang not looking at this work through a heteronormative critique or a lens, interestingly, it seems to critique the heteronormativity, which I think is really cleverly done.
I think what Kang attempts to do is to say that I'm not going to further pathologize the Dalit queer subject, and I'm not going to hyperfixate on the kind of oppression that they emit to say, or they are a representation of. And I think that's an issue I have encountered so many times across, let's say, the legal landscape or the medical landscape, at least in the context of queer individuals. Like early 2000s India or like late 90s, the only context of knowing, identifying, of being, of sort of having recognition of a queer person was that they had HIV. That was the only vocabulary of thinking about someone who was queer. Or even within the legal system, it was always through Section 377. That's how you knew queer people existed. And therefore, I think what's really radical about Kang's perspective is that heteronormativity is the structuring principle of all life everywhere. You can never do that. You can never do without that. Patriarchy is inherent everywhere. So why don't I sort of reflect the gaze back, and instead of thinking of myself as a pathologized, as an object of study, let me look at them. Let me see how they construct themselves in opposition to me, because they cannot exist without me. That's how heterosexuality also came to be, right? It wasn't a thing in itself. It's only when they identified homosexuals that they were like, oh, we need to consolidate and construct ourselves within an airtight container category.
As you were speaking, it kind of reminded me of a part of the article. They're drawing on Anjali Arondeka, who asks their readers to abandon the historical language of search and rescue and rather focus on caste and sexuality as sites of radical abundance. They ask this kind of question: I wonder where radical abundance leaves narratives of Dalit queers which proudly root themselves in loss, abandonment and grief, while simultaneously holding on to queer joy and fabulosity. And I thought this was a really interesting, like when you're saying, you know, I'm trained in history, so I'm always thinking about these questions. But when you're saying about the ways in which Dalit queers have been spoken about in primarily medicalized or legal terms, if spoken about at all, right? And so I wanted to hear both of your thoughts on this idea of radical abundance. I thought this was really interesting.
It doesn't come to me unless and until I think of queer possibilities. So I think that the antithesis of queer possibilities is where there is no radical abundance, which is a little bit final and perhaps oversimplifying or under elaborating. But at this very moment, that's how I feel.
I think Kang obviously is drawing on a lot of previous literature that Anjali Arondeka has put out, especially their book For the Record, where Arondeka talks about how we approach the archive, and particularly within Indian historiography, that's always a matter of retrieval to say, so that I am validating existence, an existence of queer individuals in the past. But this has obviously been critiqued. Also, Daniel is a critique of this, and Daniel themselves, they say that if we are using a historical method of search and rescue, it's also allowing a channel, an avenue to legitimize intolerance. It's a form of compromise that, okay, these people existed, but they were tolerated. Their existence wasn't whole or complete. And therefore, to sort of employ, as Arundhikar does, radical abundance is to think not in terms of this retrieval, but a sort of syntagmatic existence, a syntagmatic presence of queerness. And that queerness particularly can be so many things. It does not necessarily have to be latched to identity, and therefore the archive can be myriad. The archive can be a combination of so many other things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially, just trying to think of, just for myself, like the historical method. Also how, if you're trying to reframe it, I guess, as a radical abundance, how do you do that if it's not there? Do you know what I mean? Is it a radical abundance in the, there's an article from Jose Esteban Munoz who talks about ephemera as evidence, and the ways in which queer lives have always been these kind of hidden for a reason. They often don't want to be found. How do you reflect that and speak about that? And he talks about it in relation to performance, but I always think about it in relation to different forms of accessing and understanding history, right? And I think this article is also an interesting one to think about, because in a way it's also drawing on, I guess, oral histories, right? Even though it's not specifically speaking to this and it's not saying it, it's speaking about the lives and the histories of the 5 participants who were involved. But to kind of move into the second point, and feel free to speak to that or not, Dipbuk, you were speaking about the emotional aspects of this article, and I wondered if you could introduce this point.
The emotions being that as they're speaking with these different people, and they say, I think was it 4 or 5 people that they speak with, and they explain the closeness and the connectedness that they have with these people and how they are friends. The emotions is that when speaking about a friend, one ordinarily would want to not speak ill of them and not push on pressure points, which when we share intimacies with friends in various ways, then people know about those pressure points, shall we say, or those insecurities. Kang kind of pushes on a little bit of this, but when they're speaking with people, it's not written in their voice, it's written in their voice. And so the pain, or if there is any insecurity that we as readers are not aware of within what is being written and said, if it were written in a collaborative way, then that pain and emotion would come through more viscerally. But then the situation arises where how much and what pain should a person who is a friend express in order to appease us as the readers wanting to see the emotion expressed when Kang is speaking with their friends. I feel like there's so much more, but there is enough given because the pain of expression is one that is sacred within the relationship. So the emotion is one that is deep and trusting, and I appreciate Kang's navigation of that with their friends.
To sort of add to what Dipbuk had to say, I think we also sort of need to take stock that Kang ultimately is rioting within an institutional setup, and therefore how much they are allowed to write and the kind of freedom they have to write is also sort of directed. It's never independent. It's never writing a complete literary narrative or a complete report, as they might have. They have published articles previously where they have been way more emotional and expressive. And to think then about collective work and collaboration, I feel as a Dalit queer person, to participate in a project like this, to contribute to scholarship like this, should also be sort of understood as a method in collaboration. And of course, every time someone decides to collaborate this way, it's a huge emotional burden that you have to continuously face and you have to continuously articulate. To face within is one thing, but to articulate, externalize, and to have it go through peer reviewing is another game altogether.
Yeah, I think a good example from the text that speaks to what both of you are saying, right? This negotiation between wanting to do justice to your friend, but also having to get this published, right? And having to go through, I think the Feminist Review is an American, it's like a global journal, but I think they're based in America, published by Sage. I was right. New York and California. So, they're having to also publish this article through an American journal, which I think also leads to different negotiations, translation of certain thoughts and feelings and terminology. There's a large footnote at the beginning of the text that speaks about caste in like explicit ways of how they're not talking about it, how they are talking about it, where people can go if they want to learn more. Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the participants that really struck me was a conversation with Subhajit. They said that they had got into a relationship with a Brahmin man, and they, quote, revealed that they were willing to lose everything for this Brahmin man because they thought that they never had any self-worth to begin with. Kang says, I instead kept thinking about they talk about this person, like Subhajit talks about this person with love and devotion and desire. But Kang says, I instead kept thinking that the casteist Brahmin man had robbed this person, a person who had a lot of love to give. And I think, I'm going off my own notes, I think they end up saying this to the participant, which I think is interesting. Yeah, they shared their thoughts on this, and then the person responds to it. But I thought this was interesting that they didn't just leave this for analysis. They said it in the moment. And I wonder if that came from a place of, as a friend, when your friend tells you something like absolutely heartbreaking or like off the wall and you're like, whoa. Like, no, we're not going to do this. I wondered both your thoughts on this. Roshan, if you want to start.
Yeah, Shubhajit's take was quite disheartening, to say the least. It felt very poignant and at the same time very real, because what this section of the essay prompted me to think was the parallels between this experience of Dalit desire and experiences of queer desire. And it's very often that gay men, as an example from the queer community, do aspire to have relationships or to have a kind of community with straight men or straight passing gay men. And therefore expressions of queerness, the kind of policing they are subjected to, especially I feel, at least at the pride parades in India, any form of queerness or femininity that is mixed with masculinity is subject to a moral code, that these are the types of gays who are ruining the image of the community. And any kind of, let's say if you're wearing leather to a pride parade, what is the need to express yourself this way? And similarly, the Dalit experience of wanting to validate your own existence by or via an affirmation by a Brahmin man is also created by the Savarna Citations of Desire. We didn't really speak about the title itself, but for a Brahmin man to reference you to sort of advocate their own position, to say that they are accepting of you and they engage with you in a sort of proxy relation, but the biases still exist, and these biases then construct within you the desire to feel validated, the desire to be affirmed by the Brahmin man, because oh, he's progressive, and oh, he doesn't do caste-based discrimination, so I can have a relationship with him. And there are elements of social mobility just deep embedded within this relation, and the kind of social circles that you might have access to or you might be initiated into. And I think somewhere in the section, I think Shubhajit or someone else mentions that they were never introduced to their partner's upper caste friends. And the burden of intercaste friendships, it doesn't always even have to be romantic love. Even platonic love has a charge to it that one has to come to terms with. Even friendships can be a very careful mediation of the very structures that oppress you.
I really liked Subhajit's safety and rejection, I think we're looking at under that subheading. And my note says, initially I thought it was beautiful to read initially Subhajit's reminiscing of this relationship. But then I read further, and then I no longer felt that it was beautiful, but instead felt betrayal. If I was Subhajit, I might feel like I was simply a plaything. But then I read on where it says they continued, love took over, nothing else mattered, felt validated, finally felt seen by a Brahmin man. And then there's further text, and I think about how we can be in a relationship where we fall in a infatuated type of love and wanting to be in the other person's shoes, in their heart, in their body, in their mind, to evocatively see through their eyes how they experience and feel and sense. But in yearning for that which cannot ever be had or glimpsed even, because of the caste system that is so deeply rooted, it is not a case of just seeing and experiencing, even in an intimate way, how a person from a Brahmin class can see and do things, but that way of thinking, of perceiving the world through their eyes, becomes one which, as one desires to look and be in deep intimacy through love, there is also a violence that is enacted through the relationship, because, as it says later on, trust me, I recognize all the red flags. He never introduced me to his upper caste friends. He always find upper castes attractive, would often say casteist things to me. He jokingly told me one day that he would marry me had I been a girl, and then added, maybe not, because even then you would be Dalit. And that just puts up this wall that takes away the emotions and trust and desire and puts a full stop on those things progressing, as I see it. So it was hard. And I think of the work of seeking to be someone, and I think of the work of Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, but I also think of the work of Judith Butler's The Psychic Life of Power.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the when you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, and this can be romantic, but it can also be friendship, it can be family, it can be kind of anything, right? You gain an intimacy to their life and their life experiences, even if they're keeping you at bay, right? This person wasn't introduced to this person's friends. They're not accessing this world fully, but they're still gaining a certain kind of access. And I wonder if there's something there around this is both love and rejection at the same time, but it's also like wanting proximity to this person and their experiences and their access, I guess. And I wonder how much that factors in. Roshan, do you have any thoughts?
I was thinking about rejection then, and as Kang puts it in the essay, rejection as a mode of being Dalit. And therefore, to sort of articulate it in this way, that I am not who I am because I was rejected, but I take this rejection to make something off of myself. So, to sort of rethink about Shubhajit's narrative, that Shubhajit doesn't exclusively define the rejection as a loss. They still use rejection as a productive force in their life, that as a way of expression of love, and however idiosyncratic, however unique that might be, right? It's not a model, it's not a principle, it's a way for them to come to terms with rejection and make something out of it. And I feel that's where I can see the radicalness of expressing this, of putting this out in the world.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. This, do you know what it kind of reminds me of? I don't know if anybody's seeing this, but there's like a trend going around on social media of rejection therapy, of like putting yourselves in situations that you wouldn't usually, or asking for things that you wouldn't usually ask for because you're scared of being rejected, but kind of either getting used to that rejection or getting access to things that you would have just never even thought of. Yeah, it kind of reminds me on that. Before we move on to talking about queerness, I wonder, Dipbuk, do you have any kind of final thoughts on that topic?
I just wanted to say, Roshan, I love the way that you said what you said. The idea of forming, being and empowering the self through the oppression that is meted out, that there is agency and control and integrity and self-worth through forming the sense of self in opposition. I can't explain it any better than you did. Nowhere near so, but I'm really thankful for what you said.
So we haven't really touched on it. Well, we've been speaking about it and of it, but we haven't really explained it. Kang has a really interesting, I guess, formulation of queerness in relation to Dalit. And there's two interesting things that I kind of want to bring up. There's, on page 66, it says, my invocation of Savarna, its Citations of Desire, is a Dalit queer attempt to understand queer elsewhere. And they're drawing on Kasmani et al.'s call to imagine elsewhere's potential to engage with the marginalized agentive capacity to radically create new worlds. So they're basically saying Savarna, our Citations of Desire, open bridges, moves, and disrupts heteronormative and casteist imaginations of Dalit love. And then later they say that queer in this article kind of is used to name the alternative realizations and assimilations of what being a Dalit means, and to uproot its conformity to heteronormative ideologies of anti-caste policies. Queerness is not as a social and political category that people use to define their sexualities, but it's also a mode of understanding the everydayness of sociality. And I thought that was really interesting. So, Roshan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think reading this section really got me thinking into what the sort of prompt of the project was. And then I thought, it's really a project in the making that doesn't fixate on survival, doesn't fixate on wanting to stay alive, but to live in your existence, to sort of accept and embody that existence. And then to think about the everydayness of sociability or sociality, whatever Kang writes in their essay, it's to also then think about the kind of relationship that being Dalit and being queer together bring into place, because of course there's a structure here as well, structures everywhere. So first you're oppressed on the basis of caste, and then if you turn out to be queer, there are multiple segregations within that as well. And even earlier when Kang talks about the instances which they use to describe what they define as Savarna citations of desire, and even with Shubhojit we see that even within queerness as an identity, then it gets subjected to these forms of oppression. And therefore what Kang does is to stop using it as an identity, is to stop using it as a qualifier, and they start using it as a verb. And while I am intrigued by the formulation of queerness elsewhere, or as Munoz puts it, a queerness in the future, I am a little reserved about this, in the sense that this ventures a little into the abstract, and therefore while it might be hopeful and there's a lot to imagine, how many of those imaginations would get reified, would get realized, is the question.
Yeah, that reification, I like that you mentioned that, because that's where my brain was going. And I'm very conscious that I was born and raised in England, yet I have brown skin, and that is always a means for me of feeling how otherness operates. But my brain is also socialized because I was born and educated here in England. So when I read this part, I was thinking to myself, when Kang writes, harmful appropriate capacities of Savarnas to write about themselves through intercaste love, as well as use intercaste love to center narratives around themselves. And as I read that, I was thinking, can there be parallels drawn with other geographies and societies where wealth partnered with power becomes a means of harnessing the allure of dalliances with power and safety for those that feel more vociferously the surveilling nature of a governed and regulated world? How might such a consideration be helpful or be pejoratizing? Because Khan is writing about something unique and subjective and grounded in the subjectivities, whereas my brain was looking at, well, how can we better understand or pick this apart? Can we draw parallels with other societies, other cultures? But perhaps doing so could be epistemologically violent.
I think talking about epistemic violences, what Kang talks about in terms of positions of speaking, I think Gayatri Spivak has spoken about in Can the Subaltern Speak? And of course there's an entire history to scholarship on subaltern studies, but what Spivak talks about is that one cannot completely assume the position of a subaltern subject that they're trying to speak. And Spivak, of course, in the essay makes a distinction between representation and being a voice for representation. And I think if people were to revisit that essay, I think there would be a sort of, to say, a parameter to sort of go by and think through these questions. And as far as parallels transnationally, I definitely feel that there will be many sort of similar, if not likely, but similar connections, similar formations, power that structures societies in same ways. And yeah, to make sense of a brown body and to live in a white country where you are initiated into the education of the system, into the knowledge production, English knowledge production, but your lived experience is completely separated. It's a 180 opposite to how your mind is made to think about things.
I guess what's interesting here that I think speaks to both of what you're saying, but especially like Roshan, when you were talking about like queer futurity, doesn't quite connect with you, I guess, is a way of saying it. But I wonder if there's something interesting here, right? Like this article is drawing on Muñoz's work. I draw on Muñoz's work, but Muñoz is speaking from an American context and is drawing on and speaking to African American people, Latin American people, but also is speaking about a kind of queerness that is a liberal sort of queerness, right? That they're speaking against a queerness that is kind of embroiled in neoliberal subjectivities, in capitalist subjectivities. They're speaking about a different kind of queerness that I find this article. And while I think, like what you're saying with it being quite abstract, I think sometimes I like the abstraction because it makes it more applicable to more different contexts. But I wonder if that abstraction is also meaning that some of the contextually specific things don't exactly connect with what Kang is talking about. Do you get me?
Yeah, I think when you say abstraction, I don't think Kang is trying to present any form of universalized way of seeing this. I think, yes, there can be parallels drawn with understanding and perhaps deeper inquiry into how other systems of oppression work with similar means or endeavors. I think Khan has the fortitude with which Kang has been able to produce this article. I anticipate, as I've read the entries of the different people that they speak with, I anticipate there is somewhat of a pressure to make the lens more applicable to other forms of knowledge making. But Kang in their writing is navigating that. I can see it between the lines rather than within the lines. But there's so much to be drawn from understanding the castes and intercaste and the Varna and the Savarna system. As Kang writes about this, my brain goes to musical scales. And on the one hand, in Western music theory, the scales are much smaller, whereas in East Asian classical music theory, the scales are much broader and variegated. So one would initially have thought of music as being one that is universally applicable, and it is. But the ways of understanding music can be so varied in this similar way that one could seek to equate the caste system with class. But actually, it's totally different, and it's full of nuances that change the way that even class can be seen to work. So the Varna and the Savarna system, in understanding that, one can then revisit the class structures and see further nuances within it. Now, I've not done that, but I anticipate that is possible.
Yeah, just to add to what dipbuk had to say, that's a really fantastic observation, because I have actually read scholarship which identifies caste bias being expressed in idioms of class. And that's also something I'll touch upon when we go through the media examples. But especially in urban settings, especially in metropolitan setups, caste biases do inform and get coupled with class distinctions. And something as human and as helpful as domestic help in an Indian family home is particularly viewed, interpreted, interacted with through the sort of concatenated caste and class biases. They sort of go hand in hand as well.
Okay, I'm looking at the time. I think we've spoke a little bit about the methodology of this piece. I think we spoke a bit about it earlier. Dipbuk, is there anything else you want to say on that, or are you happy for us to just talk about the media?
The methodology, when Kang speaks with their friends, yes, this is a text written, and their friend's voice Kang is the conduit interpreting what people have said. Yes, there are quotes, but the quotes are chosen. And I was wondering whether in future, as there is greater work on this area, that collaboration through a creative, artistic, expressionistic means of capturing authentically, without mediation or the conduit, the voices and feelings and senses and sensualities of those friends that aren't necessarily in possession of eloquent language structures, but have other means of communicating feelings and senses that are equally, if not more, evocative.
Yeah, just as a final point on that, if people are interested in that kind of work, there's a scholar called E. Patrick Johnson that did oral histories of Black gay men and Black lesbian women in the American South. And he's got 2 books. And in conjunction to those books, he comes from a background of performance and theatre. He specifically for the first book on Black gay men or Black queer men, he performed those in the areas that he had collected the data. He went back and put on a performance of the oral histories and the interviews that took place. And then I think he got women to do the second performance rather than himself. I think he was still a part of it though. But yeah, that's just one way, or I guess one example of not mediating what your participants were saying, because he would like perform it as if he was that person. And it's really interesting, the politics of that, because you could be seen as speaking for the person, right? You're not getting them involved in the performance. But it's also a way of like, it's complicated. You don't want to out people and stuff like that, right? So yeah, that was just I guess if we're talking about media connections, that is one that people can go look at. The other media connection that I had specifically to talk about was just to shout out Queer Asia, which I know, Roshan, you were a part of now. But they've recently restarted their work. So if you're interested, and if you like the J. Daniel Luther episode especially, yeah, that Queer Asia is a really interesting group, and the work they do is really fabulous. And they also have a book, so shout out to them. If we go Dipbuk and then Roshan, if we finish on your films, that would be good.
As I was reading this article, I then was reminded by a friend only yesterday that The Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler, that this idea that one can see the violence and pain of desire and love when the person that you're in love with, or one is in love with, or one is intimately connected with, you know that the relationship can become toxic, or is toxic, or can have toxicities within it that will be deeply hurtful and damaging. Yet one cannot help themselves but yearn for the love and desire, even though it is going to ultimately lead to your own poor health, be it mental or physical. But yet there is this yearning for continuing what can in many ways be a violent, oppressive relationship for various reasons, outside societal reasons, but also from the socialized position. So yeah, that's the link that I draw.
The media connections that I want to talk about were really the sort of movies that brought me to Kang and Kang's essay. So this was actually part of a course that I had taken up in my master's degree, and we had to produce an original paper. Now it's in the pipeline. Hopefully paper is going to get published at the end of this. But the movies that I looked at is Love Enough Sir, which is a feature film. It's available on Netflix, and a short film from an anthology, Lust Stories. And my subject of inquiry was actually the domestic help, who also happened to be almost always a female domestic help. And what Kang's perspective allowed me to sort of obtain for my study was to center desire and intimacy in the relation between the domestic house help and the upper caste class homeowner, who tries to latch on his desire and control the dynamics of the relationship. So then to think through Savarna citations of desire, I could interpret this relationship as a tussle in intimacy rather than something which is fixated on identity itself. And how the plot sort of unravels is that both of them in Is Love Enough Sir, it's a romantic relationship between the homeowner and the female help. And in Lust Stories, it's a sexual relationship. And at the end of it, both men try to define the limits of the relationship based on their experiences, their constraints, and the normative expectations that are levied on them. And why the films sort of become radical for me is that the female house helps, they do not give into this. Through the intimate connection, through the access to this intimate relationship with the homeowner, they reject that. They reject the futurity of a kind of compromised relationship, a skewed relationship that they would have if, let's say, they pursued a romantic relationship, or they held on to the rejection of the sexual relationship once the man decides to marry someone of the same caste and same class. And I think if someone sort of views these films in conjunction with Kang's essay, the entire perspective sort of comes through, it becomes transparent.
Amazing. Thank you both. So, yeah, that's the end of the episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you both for joining me. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.